When people quote Benjamin Franklin saying, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety," it often lands like a moral hammer, a sharp, timeless warning. The line carries a kind of universal weight, a crisp admonition that freedom is precious, and that any compromise for the sake of security risks everything. It reads like a principle you could apply to any era, any society, any government. And yet, like so many famous quotations, the original meaning is more specific, more subtle, and far more grounded in a particular moment in history than most people realize. Franklin didn't write this as a universal maxim against government or as a philosophical treatise on liberty. He wrote it as a response to a practical, urgent question. How much authority should citizens grant to a governing body in order to protect themselves from real, immediate dangers? In Franklin's Pennsylvania, the threats were immediate, concrete, and often violent. The colonies faced attacks on settlements, raids by hostile groups, and the uncertainties of frontier life. Militias were raised, fortifications were built, and local assemblies debated how much power to grant to authorities tasked with protection. Franklin's concern was deeply practical. He wanted defense, but not at the cost of permanently handing over essential freedoms to the government. In his framing, liberty was not negotiable. It was fundamental, enduring, and constitutive of a meaningful life. Safety, by contrast, was temporary, situational, and contingent on circumstances. You could protect yourself today from a specific threat, but there was no guarantee that doing so would protect you tomorrow, and surrendering your core freedoms in the process risked losing both. Yet, over time, this quote has been abstracted, almost mythologized. Today, it is often invoked as a broad critique of government action itself, especially in debates over social programs, healthcare, taxation, or welfare. It is wielded as a rhetorical weapon. Any intervention that provides protection, assistance, or collective support is framed as trading freedom for security. The danger here is subtle but important. Franklin's world, a provisional government in a fledgling colony, militias on the frontier, and immediate physical threats, is fundamentally different from the modern world, where threats are systemic rather than purely physical, and where social safety nets are long-term structures rather than temporary expedients. To apply his caution uncritically to modern programs is to flatten the nuance, and to take a specific colonial argument and treat it as a timeless law of human society. Understanding the difference between Franklin's original context and how the quote is used today is essential. Only by appreciating what liberty and safety meant in his time and what he was actually warning against can we begin to explore how this principle might, or might not, translate into the world we live in now. In Franklin's time, liberty was not an abstract ideal. It had a very concrete texture, woven into the daily lives of ordinary people. To be free meant owning your space, your labor, your decisions, and being able to participate in your community without arbitrary interference from distant authorities. Liberty was deeply tied to property rights, to the ability to work, trade, and manage one's own household. It was also closely linked to civic participation, the freedom to vote in local assemblies, engage in town meetings, and influence decisions that affected your life directly. This kind of freedom was fragile. The colonial government existed in a constant negotiation of power between local assemblies, appointed officials, and the crown. Any permanent encroachment, taxes, coercive authority, restrictions on movement or trade, was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat to the very capacity to live as a self-determining individual. Liberty was the foundation on which all other aspects of life rested. Without it, survival itself could feel hollow, because even the simplest choices, where to live, how to work, how to raise your family, could be dictated by external authority. Safety, in contrast, was narrow and situational. It was largely physical protection aimed at defending communities from immediate threats, raids, attacks, or natural dangers. Militia musters, fortifications, and neighborhood watches were temporary measures that could repel a threat at one moment, but offered no guarantee of enduring security. If a settlement was left undefended, danger returned quickly. In Franklin's world, safety was contingent, fragile, and constantly in negotiation. A matter of preparedness and vigilance, not structural certainty. The tension Franklin warned about emerges from this dynamic. Granting a government extensive authority to protect citizens might create the illusion of safety, but if that authority infringes on essential liberties, you risk losing both. Your freedom to act, to own, to participate, or to dissent can be permanently eroded, while the promised protection may fail or be short-lived. It's a compelling and vivid warning, but one deeply rooted in the contingencies of 18th century colonial life. This is not a caution against governance in general or against collective security programs in a modern sense. It is a warning about temporary situational safety measures turning into permanent restrictions on liberty, and the risk of confusing the two. Understanding the specific textures of liberty and safety in Franklin's time is crucial. It's what makes the quote so powerful, but also what makes its modern application tricky. Liberty and safety were not abstract concepts. They were lived experiences, shaped by the precariousness of frontier life, the limits of communication, and the very tangible threat of physical danger. Today, Franklin's quote is often wielded like a rhetorical weapon in debates over taxation, social welfare, universal health care, and other forms of government intervention. Critics present these programs as a kind of moral compromise, arguing that providing for people's basic needs is equivalent to trading liberty for safety. The underlying implication is that any measure which limits individual discretion, even to fund education, healthcare, or housing, is an infringement on freedom, no matter how beneficial it might be. But this framing misses the critical distinction. Unlike the temporary, situation-specific safety measures Franklin was warning against, modern social programs are structural and long-term. They are not stopgap militias or fortifications built for a particular raid. They are systems embedded into the framework of society, designed to ensure stability, protect lives, and provide opportunities in a complex, interdependent world. They are deliberate, enduring, and in principle, subject to democratic oversight. The modern threats people face are also profoundly different. In colonial Pennsylvania, danger was immediate and physical: raids, armed attacks, and other short-term threats to life and property. Today, threats are more systemic, more diffuse, and often invisible. Economic insecurity, the erosion of middle-class livelihoods, structural inequality, and increasingly, displacement caused by automation and technological disruption. Safety in this context is not about fortifying your town against an attack next week. It's about ensuring that citizens have the resources, stability, and freedom to survive and thrive in a society shaped by forces far beyond their individual control. In this light, applying Franklin's 18th century warning directly to modern social programs is misleading. Temporary contingent safety that Franklin warned against is very different from a permanent systemic security that the social safety nets provide. The modern application flips the old logic on its head. Rather than constraining freedom, structural support can actually expand meaningfully liberty, allowing people to pursue knowledge, creativity, and opportunity without the constant existential threat of poverty or deprivation. This misinterpretation lies in treating safety as a narrow, short-term commodity and liberty as a zero-sum game. But in today's interconnected post-industrial society, safety and liberty are mutually reinforcing, not inherently opposed. The real shift comes with technology. Automation, artificial intelligence, and highly advanced production systems are driving the marginal cost of goods and services towards zero. In other words, producing an extra unit of almost anything, food, energy, clothing, even advanced manufactured goods, can become virtually costless. When this happens, the very foundations of our economic system begin to change. Historically, scarcity shaped the framework of capitalism. Goods had costs because producing them required labor, raw materials, and energy. Labor itself had value because it was scarce. Survival depended on participating in the economy, earning wages, and exchanging labor for resources. Social safety nets, when they existed at all, were often seen as temporary concessions, a trade-off between individual liberty and collective protection. If a government provided food, healthcare, or shelter, critics argued, it could diminish personal freedom by creating dependency or requiring coercive taxation. The moral logic of scarcity framed liberty and security as opposing forces. But when production becomes nearly costless, when machines and AI can efficiently produce essentials, this old framework collapses. Scarcity no longer forces a trade-off between liberty and survival. If basic needs, food, housing, healthcare, education, even energy, can be reliably and efficiently provided, then ensuring access to these resources becomes the foundation for true liberty, rather than a threat to it. Without guaranteed access to essentials, autonomy is hollow. How free can someone be if every decision is constrained by the fear of hunger, homelessness, or illness? Survival itself dominates every choice, leaving no room for creativity, self-expression, or long-term planning. True liberty isn't merely freedom from interference. It is freedom to live fully, safely, and meaningfully. Automation and post-scarcity technology have the potential to shift society into a new paradigm, one in which liberty and safety are no longer in tension. They can reinforce each other rather than oppose each other. Security becomes an enabler of freedom. Access to resources is not a handout. It is a precondition for the kind of autonomy Franklin and others could only imagine within the constraints of scarcity. The implications are profound. We are entering a world where the moral, economic, and social logic of the past, where liberty couldn't be traded for temporary protection, loses its relevance. Survival is no longer a primary constraint on freedom, and society can begin to rethink what it means to live a truly autonomous, flourishing life. In a post-automation world, liberty is no longer simply freedom from governmental interference or the absence of coercion. It evolves into something far deeper: freedom from existential insecurity. The stakes change because scarcity, the traditional constraint on human freedom, is no longer the defining condition of life. When people no longer have to worry constantly about food, shelter, energy, or healthcare, liberty takes on an entirely new meaning. Liberty now means the freedom to pursue knowledge, creativity, and personal growth. It is the ability to explore ideas, learn new skills, experiment, and innovate without the ever-present fear of deprivation. A musician can focus on composing music rather than worrying about whether they can afford rent. A scientist can explore bold theories without the constant pressure of generating income. Creativity, curiosity, and discovery flourish when basic survival is guaranteed. Liberty also means choosing your path without being constrained by the bare necessities of survival. Today, millions of people's choices are limited by economic insecurity: what job to take, where to live, whether to have children, whether to pursue education. Post-automation safety nets change that calculus. With reliable access to essentials, people gain the ability to make decisions based on aspirations and interest rather than necessity. Freedom is no longer conditional. It becomes structural. And liberty means designing your life rather than being trapped in the struggle to subsist. In our current system, much of human energy is consumed by survival work, often in repetitive, low-skill labor. Automation has the potential to free individuals from this cycle, allowing life to be organized around purpose, passion, and long-term goals, rather than mere subsistence. Here, freedom is creative and expansive, not merely defensive. In this context, the tension Franklin described, liberty versus temporary safety, shifts dramatically. Providing a permanent, reliable safety net does not diminish liberty. It enhances it. Security becomes an enabler rather than a constraint. When existential threats are removed or mitigated, freedom expands into domains that were previously inaccessible. True liberty becomes a capacity to live a rich, self-directed life, not merely the absence of coercion. This redefinition has profound implications. It suggests that policies, which some critics label as restrictive or coercive, in fact create the conditions for authentic autonomy. They do not take away freedom, they enable it. In a society where technology can produce abundance efficiently, liberty and security are no longer opposing forces. Instead, they become mutually reinforcing. Safety allows choice, and choice expresses freedom. By reframing liberty in this way, we can begin to see a society where Franklin's warning about trading freedom for temporary safety no longer applies in the same way. When security is structural and permanent, it does not threaten liberty, it realizes it. And that realization opens the door to a world of human potential, previously constrained by scarcity and survival. It's crucial to understand the distinction Franklin was making. His warning was about temporary safety measures transforming into permanent encroachments on freedom. In this context, a militia or defensive fortification might be necessary to protect a community for a season, but granting unchecked authority to enforce that protection risked undermining the very liberties it claimed to defend. Temporary solutions, if extended or abused, could erode the foundation of self-determination. Modern social systems operate under a fundamentally different principle. Programs like universal health care, social welfare, guaranteed education, and infrastructure support are structural, stable, and justifiable. They are not provisional stopgap measures reacting to a crisis. They are designed to create a permanent, reliable framework in which people can live secure, autonomous lives. Unlike a temporary fortification, these systems are not inherently coercive. They provide the conditions under which freedom becomes meaningful rather than threatening it. Of course, vigilance is still necessary. Any system, no matter how well designed, can be corrupted, mismanaged, or misused, as we're kind of seeing. Centralized power, even when well-intentioned, carries the risk of abuse. But the principle flips when safety is embedded structurally. Liberty is no longer automatically at risk. Instead, security becomes a platform on which liberty is exercised. Consider the difference. In Franklin's time, safety was fleeting, conditional, and often enforced through coercion. Modern structural safety, in contrast, is permanent, predictable, and accessible. When citizens can rely on these systems, freedom is no longer just the absence of interference. It is the capacity to act, choose, and flourish. Security becomes enabling rather than limiting. This shift in perspective is profound. Franklin's caution about the dangers of temporary measures retains its value, but its applications must adapt. Today, the question is no longer whether to preserve liberty at the cost of fleeting protection. The question becomes, how can we design social, technological, and economic systems that embed security in a way that maximizes human freedom? In other words, structural security doesn't violate liberty, it realizes it. By ensuring that survival and opportunity are guaranteed, we remove the existential constraints that have historically limited the exercise of true freedom. And in doing so, we create a society where safety and liberty are not in tension, they are mutually reinforcing. Think of it this way. In a post-scarcity automated society, the old trade-off between liberty and safety begins to dissolve. When technology can reliably provide for the essentials of life, food, energy, healthcare, shelter, and access to information, then the framework that once forced us to choose between survival and freedom no longer applies. Providing universal access to resources doesn't take away freedom. It creates the conditions for real, meaningful freedom. When people are no longer constrained by existential scarcity, they gain the ability to make choices based on aspiration, creativity, and purpose, rather than mere survival. A student can pursue education without worrying about whether they can afford meals. An artist can dedicate themselves to their craft without fear of eviction. An entrepreneur or innovator can take risks without risking destitution. Security becomes the foundation for liberty rather than its limitation. Temporary crises no longer dictate the trade-off between freedom and protection. Instead, systems are designed to permanently guarantee basic capabilities. Social and technological infrastructures can ensure that everyone has the tools they need to thrive, even as individual circumstances fluctuate. Unlike Franklin's colonial Pennsylvania, where protection had to be negotiated constantly and was contingent on immediate threats, in a post-automation world, security is embedded and predictable. This stability allows people to focus on growth, creativity, and self-determination rather than constant survival. As a result, liberty and safety are no longer opposites. They converge. Real security is not an obstacle to autonomy. It is a prerequisite. Freedom is meaningless without the assurance that basic needs will be met, and security is meaningless if it restricts the capacity to live a full, self-directed life. By guaranteeing access to essential resources, society creates the conditions for both autonomy and flourishing simultaneously. The paradox Franklin warned about, the risk of surrendering liberty for temporary safety, dissolves in this new context. We no longer face an either-or choice between freedom and vulnerability. Instead, we can consciously design societies where liberty and safety reinforce each other, where structural security enables autonomy, and where freedom is measured not by the absence of constraint alone, but by the presence of opportunity. In this light, Franklin's insight remains valuable, but its meaning shifts. He cautioned against trading freedom for ephemeral protection. Today, the lesson is not to fear structural support. It is to recognize that true freedom is inseparable from the security and capabilities that allow human potential to flourish. In a world of abundance, liberty and safety are not conflicting ideas. They are complementary pillars of a fully realized society. Even in a post-automation, post-scarcity world, Franklin's warning retains relevance, just in a new form. The danger is no longer that temporary safety measures will erode freedom in a zero-sum trade-off. The danger is that any system of power, no matter how well-intentioned, can be misused, corrupted, or mismanaged. Structural security is powerful, but power itself is always subject to human fallibility. This means that systems must be transparent, accountable, and flexible. Transparency ensures that citizens understand how resources are distributed, how decisions are made, and who is responsible for oversight. Accountability ensures that misuse, inefficiency, or corruption can be corrected before it undermines the system. Flexibility allows the system to adapt to unforeseen challenges, technological, social, or environmental, without collapsing or overreaching into coercion. Citizens must remain vigilant, not because security inherently threatens freedom, but because any concentration of authority carries risk. Even a system designed to guarantee safety and opportunity can become oppressive if oversight is absent, or if incentives encourage abuse. Vigilance here is an expression of freedom itself, the act of ongoing participation of the public in shaping and defending the structures that support them. The key lesson is that the structure matters. Security and liberty can coexist, and even reinforce each other, but only if the systems providing security are designed and maintained with care. This requires constant attention, robust checks and balances, and a culture that values both individual freedom and collective well-being. Citizens must treat these systems not as static entitlements, but as living frameworks that require engagement, stewardship, and thoughtful evolution. In short, the promise of post-automation liberty depends not just on technology or abundance, but on the quality of governance and civic culture. We can ensure security without eroding liberty, but it demands deliberate design, ethical oversight, and active participation. The structures that guarantee access to essentials, food, healthcare, housing, education, and energy must be built to empower, not dominate, to enable choice, not constrain it, and to expand freedom rather than restrict it. Franklin's caution transforms into a new imperative. Freedom is no longer endangered by the provision of security itself, but it must be protected through the design, management, and oversight of the very systems that provide that security. The lesson is not to fear abundance or safety. It is to recognize that liberty is only meaningful when the structures that support it are robust, transparent, and aligned with human flourishing. Benjamin Franklin's words were a warning rooted in the realities of his time. A time when communities faced immediate physical threats, and when liberty could be imperiled by granting too much temporary authority to protect against those threats. His admonition was sharp, practical, and moral. Be careful how much freedom you surrender, even in the name of safety. But in the 21st century, as technology and automation reshape the world, Franklin's warning takes on a profoundly different meaning. Scarcity, the condition that historically forced the trade-off between liberty and survival, is fading. Advanced production systems, artificial intelligence, and near-zero marginal cost technologies make abundance possible. And with that abundance comes the opportunity to address existential insecurity, structurally, reliably, and universally. The trade-off Franklin described no longer define our choices. In fact, it can and should be transcended. In a society where survival is guaranteed, liberty need not be sacrificed for safety. The relationship flips. Safety, when properly understood and embedded, becomes the foundation of liberty itself. Providing access to food, housing, healthcare, education, and energy does not constrain freedom. It creates the condition in which meaningful freedom can exist. People are no longer making choices out of fear, necessity, or coercion. They can make choices based on aspiration, curiosity, creativity, and long-term purpose. In this light, Franklin's caution is no longer a constraint. It is a guide. It reminds us that freedom is fragile if taken for granted, and that systems designed to provide security must be transparent, accountable, and aligned with human flourishing. Protect essential freedoms, yes, but also design systems for collective security that enable autonomy rather than restrict it. Recognize that liberty and safety can coexist. And not only coexist, they can mutually reinforce one another, creating a society where freedom is deepened, not diminished, by protection. The challenge is ours. The structures, technologies, and knowledge exist to reimagine what it means to live free in a world where abundance is possible. But realizing that vision requires intention, care, and engagement. We must build a society where freedom and protection are not opposites, but partners in human flourishing, where the promise of liberty is strengthened by security, and the guarantee of security empowers every individual to fully realize their potential. Franklin's words still speak to us, but now they speak not only as a warning, but as a call to action. To create a world where liberty is expansive, safety is enabling, and both together form the foundation for a truly flourishing human nature.